What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games that I think aged very well, which I think is an interesting topic, especially for a channel that plays a lot of old games. In fact, it's really no secret that much of my bread and butter are CRPGs from like 20 years ago, and while I love them, and I'm sure my audience does as well, I'll be the first person to tell you a lot of those games have not aged very well. And so I thought this might make for a fun video talking about the games that I think have, which is interesting because it's a bit of a mixed bag in that regard. I think there's plenty of games that don't age particularly well. I mean, graphics are an obvious point, but even just down to things like mechanics and how they operate is really more in line with what I'm referring to. That doesn't necessarily make a game bad by any stretch. I think some of my favorite games of all time have actually aged pretty poorly. An easy example would be the original version of Oblivion. I love that game and that version. However, it aged pretty badly. But long story short, just because a game aged poorly doesn't make it any less good, more so just harder to play, if anything. Some games, on the other hand, though, manage to retain a great deal of playability, and I think as a total experience remain just as good today as the day in which they released. With that in mind, a couple of qualifiers. For something to have aged well, it has to have actually aged a bit, and so if it's newer than like the last 10 years, that's obviously a no-go. I'm going at least a decade back. Remakes and remasters are a little bit tricky. Generally, it's a no. I'm mainly referring to the originals in this video, and so keep that in mind as we move through this. But the one I wanted to mention the most, and a game I've been messing around with recently myself, is actually Xcom, Enemy Unknown, which originally came out all the way back in 2012, with its follow-up, which is equally great, actually coming out in 2016. So for this video, we're talking about the original Xcom. But on one hand, it's a fantastic tactics game that I think takes the idea of an alien invasion and fighting back against it to a really great and grounded place that emphasizes tactics and strategy and all that stuff. And while all of that's great, I think really what actually sets XCOM as like a timeless classic in many ways is actually something much simpler. You see, XCOM Enemy Unknown has kind of set the standard for what TRPGs are these days, or tactical games in general, because games have spent the last 13 years copying their homework, basically, and I think probably the best legacy you could ask for as a game is to have like set the standard for what the next decade of games in the same genre are planning to do. XCOM Enemy Unknown aged so well that even these days, tactics games are just straight up doing the same thing half the time. It's an unavoidable pillar of the genre at this point. But really, that's just the beginning, because next up, I wanted to talk about none other than The Witcher 3. Now, I know as I say that, some of you are jumping directly to your keyboards to type a furious comment that The Witcher 3 couldn't possibly have aged well. It released only a couple of years ago. Well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but The Witcher 3 is actually 10.5 years old, with it originally releasing in May of 2015. But I think it having aged well is no surprise otherwise, though, given that it was a pretty monumental effort for CD Projekt Red, and while I think if you play it in the year of 2025, the cracks are just now starting to show, really. But even a decade later, it is still far beyond the scope of most things that release, both in terms of graphics, gameplay size, etc. And while some of that is certainly filler in terms of like map objectives, that kind of thing, The Witcher 3 was incredible then, and it's incredible now. Speaking of incredible, though, a game I was actually pretty excited to add to this was the original Dishonored, which released back in 2012. I initially actually wanted to talk about Dishonored 2, but that one has actually released in 2016. However, the case remains that the original Dishonored still plays incredibly well. When you pick up games like this, I think, especially if you haven't played them previously, you kind of expect a certain level of, let's say, creaky bones, but I think Dishonored really manages to sidestep that. While the graphics are a little muddy by today's standards, it still looks really good. But more importantly, gameplay-wise, it is incredibly snappy to this day. I mean, you can find YouTube compilations of people doing all sorts of crazy stuff in either Dishonored game. But what's interesting to me is that as you play it, you can kind of just feel that sort of fluidity and responsiveness that allows people to do stuff like that. And utilizing your powers feels great. And then moving through a given area and being able to interact with it in all these different ways, utilizing said powers, just feels awesome, which is why I think it holds up to this day. Speaking of immersive sims, however, next up we've got BioShock 2. So this is an interesting one. The original is released in 2007 and 2010 for 2 specifically, but they actually received remasters roughly a decade later, I think like 2016, and those are almost certainly what you would buy if you were to buy those games today. However, the remasters actually come with the originals, with the remasters primarily sort of upscaling like graphics, bringing 4K resolution support, stuff like that. So that's kind of why I'm giving this one a pass. However, while most people would tell you how great the original BioShock is and, everything it did with its story, which is true to be fair, for me personally, I'd have to go BioShock 2 for this one. The original game has a fantastic story. That is absolutely true. It is worth experiencing. However, the gameplay of it is very simplistic, and while I, wouldn't say it aged badly, it's kind of just okay. Compare that then to BioShock 2, which I think plays significantly better than 1, but also in a way that is more enjoyable to me, at least, than Infinite even. And so just for the sake of being like a joy to play, BioShock 2 definitely has my vote on that front. Though I will say the original also aged pretty well. I think it's mostly a matter of preference and semantics, but for me personally, again, hands down the second game. Either way, though, I think the story, the setting of Rapture as a whole, across 1 and 2, really, but in 2, the DLC of Minerva's Den, everything they did with the combat improvements, the dual wielding, the rivet gun, all those other subtle tweaks made BioShock 2 just a fantastic experience. And obviously, one that I think still holds up super well, but that does bring us to our final entry, and I just had to squeeze one of my favorite games in here somewhere, and it is, of course, Diablo 2. Now, this is a game that did technically get a proper remaster with Diablo 2 Resurrected, but truth be told, I'm still more than happy to play the original one. Obviously, the graphics didn't exactly stand the test of time given how old the game actually is, and yet, I wanted to bring up Diablo 2 in this video specifically because while I enjoy a good ARPG, I think they're a bit of mindless fun a lot of the time, most of the modern ones have went in a direction that I'm just not really interested in following, with a huge emphasis on multiplayer and seasonal content, which makes the rare occasional release of something like Titan Quest II, which isn't trying to do those things, of great interest to me. It still remains the case that Diablo 2 is just more fun to me than basically all of those games. And while I'm more than aware that plenty of people prefer Path of Exile these days, and I'm glad people enjoy that, I think Path of Exile is great, and yet I still think Diablo 2 offers a unique experience that is worth experiencing, because they just nailed it. Everything from, things like the little sound effects they use, the UI, the exact tone of the graphics even at the time have just this very specific feel that I think even today is really great and stands up. To the point that I'd still rather play Diablo 2 than almost any other modern day ARPG, because I still think it's the better game in most cases. But all of that said, that's pretty much going to do it for today. There's some video games that I think have aged particularly well, though honestly, I think a lot of older titles, especially if they are made with some timelessness in mind and they just aren't chasing things like basic graphical fidelity, then more often than not, I think their core experience can still be played and enjoyed even in the modern day. And so to that end, I'd love to hear about more games you think have aged particularly well. These are just some ones that I had in mind. If you want to hit me with games that aged poorly, you can certainly do that as well. For instance, I love Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, but I don't think they aged very well. But basically, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.